The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for Remote ID was published on December 31st, 2019. The FAA included the following real-world examples to show how remote ID is going to be implemented. There are three tiers of remote identification. These are standard remote ID, limited remote ID, and no remote ID. The acronyms used in the following examples are UAS and USS. UAS stands for Unmanned Aircraft System and is synonymous with a drone. USS stands for UAS Service Supplier and is a company designated by the FAA to provide services to drones. The FAA is providing the following example operating scenarios for drones operating with remote identification capabilities. 1. Subscribing to a USS. Kim decides to give her daughter Emily a UAS for her birthday. Emily, excited to finally have her own UAS, eagerly unwraps the package so she can begin taking aerial selfies. Under FAA rules, Emily's drone must be registered and therefore comes with remote identification. The UAS will not take off unless it is connected to a remote ID USS. In order to comply with the remote identification requirement, Kim researches FAA qualified remote ID USS on the FAA's website and decides to subscribe to Alpha USS. Emily's UAS was designed to pair with her smartphone and connect to the remote ID USS through her smartphone's internet connection. After Emily's UAS connects to Alpha USS, she is able to start using her drone to take selfies. 2. Operating a standard remote identification UAS. Patty has a photography business and has decided to purchase a UAS to take aerial photos for weddings and other events. She researched different types of UAS and their capabilities and determined that she needs a UAS that can operate more than 400 feet from its control station. Patty decides to buy a standard remote identification UAS. Because the UAS has standard remote identification, it is designed to 1. Connect to the internet and transmit the remote identification message elements through that internet connection to a remote ID USS, and 2. Broadcast the same message elements directly from the unmanned aircraft. Patty sees that the UAS she wants to buy has a label that says it is a standard remote identification UAS. Regardless, Patty checked the FAA's website to confirm that the UAS she is buying has a valid FAA-accepted declaration of compliance. Because the UAS was listed on the FAA website, the UAS meets the requirements of Part 89. Patty intends to operate her UAS for business purposes, so the operations are subject to operating rules in Part 107, which require her to register the unmanned aircraft with the FAA. Patty goes online to the FAA Drone Zone website, applies for and is issued a certificate of aircraft registration under Part 48. As part of the application process, Patty submits her unmanned aircraft serial number. Because Patty is required to register unmanned aircraft under Part 48, she is subject to the remote identification operation requirements in Part 89. Patty then subscribes online to Alpha USS, an FAA qualified remote ID USS. Her UAS is designed to connect to the internet by automatically pairing with her personal smartphone when the phone is running an application provided by Alpha USS. Each time Patty uses her UAS, it automatically transmits the standard remote identification UAS's remote identification message elements through that internet connection to Alpha USS. Patty chooses to use her unmanned aircraft serial number for the UAS identification message element, but in the future, she may instead choose to use a session ID assigned by Alpha USS. Sometimes, Patty's UAS loses its internet connection while she is operating in rural areas. She can continue to operate as long as the unmanned aircraft is still broadcasting the remote identification message elements. During one operation, Patty's UAS indicated that, due to malfunction, the unmanned aircraft was no longer broadcasting the message elements, at which point she landed the unmanned aircraft as soon as practicable. During a different operation, Patty's UAS attempts to connect to Alpha USS at the time of takeoff, but Alpha's remote identification service is unavailable because Alpha's server is down. Patty's UAS can still connect to the internet through her smartphone, and she discovers that an alternate FAA-qualified remote ID USS Bravo is available. Patty's UAS connects to Bravo USS and is able to fly her UAS. Patty's subscription with Alpha USS provides for a roaming feature that allows her to connect to other available USS free of charge so she can have uninterrupted service. If her subscription did not provide this roaming feature, Patty would have had to pay an associated fee directly to Bravo. This is because if any remote ID USS is available, even if it is not the one she contracted with, her UAS is designed to connect to it through the internet. As long as she can connect to the internet, it is incumbent on Patty to connect to a USS. Only when the UAS cannot connect to the internet would the unmanned aircraft be able to take off while only broadcasting. On another occasion, Patty is unable to connect to Alpha USS at the time of takeoff due to a disruption in Alpha's service, but Bravo is also experiencing problems. There are no other publicly available remote ID USS. Because Patty's UAS is designed not to take off when it has access to the internet but is not connected to a remote ID USS, her unmanned aircraft would not take off. Her service would be interrupted until Alpha, Bravo, or another publicly available USS became available. 3. Operating a limited remote identification UAS. Charlie purchases a used UAS that looks like a spaceship. The UAS weighs more than 0.55 pounds, and he intends to operate it outside his house for recreational purposes, such as filming his daughter's soccer games and entertaining his sons who love science fiction movies. The person who sold Charlie the UAS assures him it is remote identification compliant. Because the company responsible for production of the UAS was required to label the unmanned aircraft to indicate that it is remote identification compliant, Charlie is able to confirm the seller's assurance by reading the label affixed to the aircraft. Charlie's UAS is a limited remote identification UAS, which means it is designed and produced to operate no more than 400 feet from its control station and cannot broadcast remote identification message elements. Under Part 89, he is only allowed to operate his limited remote identification unmanned aircraft within visual line of sight. Prior to his purchase, Charlie visits the FAA's website and confirms that his UAS has an FAA-accepted declaration of compliance. After the previous UAS owner deregisters the unmanned aircraft as required by Part 49, Charlie goes online to the FAA Drone Zone website, applies for, and is issued a certificate of aircraft registration under Part 48. During the registration process, he provides the UAS manufacturer name, the model name, and the aircraft's manufacturer-issued serial number. Because Charlie is required to register his unmanned aircraft, he is also subject to the remote identification operating rules in Part 89. This means that before Charlie can start to use the UAS, he must subscribe to a USS. He subscribes to Bravo, an FAA-qualified remote ID USS, and opts to use the unmanned aircraft serial number for the UAS identification message element. Charlie's UAS is designed to pair with his smartphone to transmit the remote identification message elements through an internet connection to a USS. Because Charlie's UAS cannot broadcast remote identification message elements, it does not function unless his smartphone is connected to the internet and transmitting through the internet connection to a Bravo USS. If Charlie's UAS loses connection to either the internet or is unable to transmit to Bravo USS in the middle of an operation, he would be required to land the aircraft as soon as practicable. Charlie may take off again as soon as his UAS reestablishes its connection to the internet and can transmit to a remote ID USS. 4. Operating a UAS without remote identification. Linus wants to fly a UAS without remote identification that he assembled at home from parts he bought at a hobby shop a few years ago. He uses his unmanned aircraft exclusively as a model aircraft. Since he has registered his unmanned aircraft in 2018, before the effective date of the remote identification rule, he was not required to provide any specific information about the aircraft, such as the serial number. Linus's aircraft registration expires in 2021, and he will renew the registration of his unmanned aircraft on the FAA Drone Zone website. At that time, he would have to submit the unmanned aircraft's manufacturer and model name as part of the registration process. Because Linus built his own UAS, he plans to use his own name as the manufacturer and use a model number of his choosing. Because his UAS does not have any remote identification capabilities, Linus knows he may only operate it within an FAA-recognized identification area. Linus is a member of the Arizona Amateur Modelers Organization, which has an FAA-recognized identification area near his home. He found information about AAM's FAA-recognized identification area at the FAA website and has agreed to AAM's terms and conditions for operating within the FAA-recognized identification area. While operating there, Linus makes sure that both he and the unmanned aircraft physically stay within the boundaries of the FAA-recognized identification area. Linus operates the unmanned aircraft within visual line of sight and in accordance with any applicable operational rules and site-specific safety guidelines. 5. Flying in an FAA-recognized identification area. Scenario 1. Linus owns another UAS, which is Standard Remote Identification UAS, and wants to operate it at AAM's FAA-recognized identification area. Since his second UAS is a Standard Remote Identification UAS, even when operating within the boundaries of the FAA-recognized identification area, he is still required to ensure that the Standard Remote Identification UAS transmits the applicable remote identification message elements through an internet connection to a remote ID USS and broadcasts directly from the unmanned aircraft. The remote identification requirements for Linus are no different inside or outside of the FAA-recognized identification area when he is operating a UAS with remote identification. Scenario 2. Linus owns a third UAS, this one a limited remote identification UAS, which was given to him as a birthday present. He decided he would try out his new limited remote identification UAS after he finished posting on his blog. While working on his computer, there was a massive power outage that took out all communications in the city. Since Linus lost a connection to the internet in both his computer and his mobile phone, he decided he would go out and fly his limited remote identification UAS at the nearby FAA-recognized identification area until the internet came back and he could finish working on his blog. When Linus arrived at the FAA-recognized identification area, he took out the limited remote identification UAS from its box, turned it on, and attempted to fly. The limited remote identification UAS did not lift off. Linus realized that he was going to have to go back home and get his standard remote identification UAS, or his UAS with no remote identification capabilities. Even though he was at an FAA-recognized identification area, he would not be able to fly his limited remote identification UAS because the limited remote identification UAS cannot broadcast remote identification message elements and was produced to meet requirements that prevent it from taking off when it cannot connect to the internet and transmit to a remote ID USS. Linus will be able to operate his limited remote identification UAS at the FAA-recognized identification area or elsewhere when the connection to the internet is re-established and his limited remote identification UAS is able to transmit to a remote ID USS. Scenario 3. Sam is cleaning out his closet and finds a UAS that he bought a number of years ago. The UAS was purchased before the remote identification rule went into effect, and the unmanned aircraft weighs 1 pound. He remembers registering the unmanned aircraft, but knows it does not have remote identification. Sam is aware that some older UAS manufactured without remote identification could receive a software update that makes them remote identification compliant. He checks the UAS manufacturer's website, but unfortunately his model of UAS is not eligible for an update. Because Sam's unmanned aircraft is required to be registered and does not have remote identification, Sam can only operate it at an FAA-recognized identification area.